Traditional MFA is no longer enough. In 2026, attackers don't guess passwords. They steal session tokens. They proxy authentication flows. They trick users into approving push notifications. And when that happens, your security reports still say, MFA was successful. So the real question is not, did the user authenticate? The real question is, how strong was the identity proofing? And how resistant was the authentication mechanism? This is where Identity Assurance Level, IAL, and Authentication Assurance Level, AAL, become the difference between compliance and compromise. Today, we bridge NIST guidance with real Microsoft Entra ID implementation and align it directly with SC 300 exam objectives. The identity assurance problem. Most organizations still operate under a dangerous assumption. Password plus OTP equals secure. And for many years, that was good enough. But the threat landscape in 2026 does not attack passwords. It attacks sessions. It attacks tokens. It attacks the authentication flow itself. Let's break this down. Modern MFA bypass techniques. Adversary-in-the-Middle, AiTM. In an AiTM attack, the attacker does not steal your password directly. Instead, they build a phishing site that acts as a reverse proxy between the victim and a legitimate login portal. The victim enters username, password, OTP, or approves a push notification. The proxy forwards everything in real time to the real service. The authentication succeeds. MFA was technically completed, but the attacker captures the session cookie, the authentication token, the refresh token. Now the attacker is authenticated. Without ever knowing the password again, MFA worked. Security failed. Token replay. Traditional OTP-based MFA proves that you had access to a second factor at a specific moment. It does not prove that the session is cryptographically bound to your device. The token cannot be reused elsewhere. The authentication is resistant to replay. If an attacker captures a valid token, they can reuse it until expiration. Nothing in OTP prevents this. Session hijacking. Once authenticated, users operate inside a trusted session. If an attacker steals a session cookie, through phishing, through malware, through browser compromise, they bypass authentication entirely. The system sees user already authenticated. No challenge occurs. Again, MFA worked. Assurance did not. MFA fatigue attacks. Push notification-based MFA created a new vulnerability. Human exhaustion. Attackers repeatedly send authentication prompts until the user eventually clicks approve. This is not a cryptographic failure. It is a psychological one. And OTP or push-based systems provide no resistance to this. Why OTP is not assurance? An OTP proves one thing. The user had access to a registered factor at that moment. It does not prove the authentication is phishing resistant. The session is bound to hardware. The token cannot be proxied. The private key never leaves a secure element. OTP is possession-based. Assurance is resistance-based. And that is the gap most organizations fail to understand. This is where NIST SP 863B changed the conversation. Instead of asking, is MFA enabled? NIST asks two deeper questions. 1. How was the identity originally proofed? Identity Assurance Level, IAL. 2. How resistant is the authentication mechanism? Authentication Assurance Level, AAL. This separation is critical because identity verification and authentication strength are not the same thing. You can have strong authentication for a poorly proofed identity, or strongly proofed identity protected by weak authentication. Both are security failures. The layered assurance model. Think of assurance as a layered trust stack. Layer 1, identity proofing. Are we sure this person is who they claim to be? Layer 2, authentication strength. Is the authentication resistant to phishing and replay? Layer 3, session protection. Is the session bound to hardware and cryptographically protected? Traditional MFA only touches layer 2, and even then weakly, assurance spans all layers. Why this matters for SC 300. In SC 300, you are not tested on enabling MFA. You are tested on designing identity architecture. You must understand when to require phishing-resistant authentication, when privilege roles demand higher assurance, how conditional access enforces authentication strength, why hardware-backed credentials reduce attack surface, how to block legacy authentication. The exam expects you to think like an architect. If a scenario says, executives are targeted with token replay attacks, the answer is not, enable SMS MFA. The answer is, enforce phishing-resistant authentication strength and hardware-bound credentials. That distinction comes from understanding AL. Compliance versus real security. Many organizations configure MFA because audit requires it, but compliance-driven MFA often stops at AL2. True zero-trust environments move toward AAL3 for high-risk access. Compliance asks, is MFA enabled? Security asks, is authentication phishing-resistant and hardware-bound? That is the identity assurance problem, and solving it requires aligning identity proofing IAL, authentication strength AL, conditional access enforcement, risk-based policy design. So before we configure anything inside Entra ID, we must first understand this. Authentication is not about adding factors. It is about increasing resistance, and that resistance is measured in assurance levels. Now that we understand the problem, let's break down identity assurance level in detail. Identity assurance level, IAL, before we talk about authentication strength, before we talk about phishing resistance, we must answer a more fundamental question. Are we even sure the person behind the account is who they claim to be? That question defines identity assurance level. What is identity assurance level? Identity assurance level, or IAL, measures how confidently can we verify the real-world identity of a digital account holder. Notice something important. IAL is not about login strength. It is not about MFA. It is not about FIDO2. IAL is about identity proofing. It answers, was this identity properly verified before we trusted it? Because strong authentication protecting a fake identity is still a security failure. Why identity proofing matters. Imagine two scenarios. Scenario 1. An attacker creates a fake contractor identity using weak onboarding controls. Later, that identity is protected with strong phishing-resistant MFA. Authentication is strong, but the identity was never legitimate. Security failed at layer 1. Scenario 2. A real executive goes through strict onboarding, background verification, document validation. But later, their account protected only by SMS OTP. Identity is strong. Authentication is weak. Security failed at layer 2. Assurance requires both. IAL addresses layer 1. The 3 identity assurance levels. Let's break down IAL in practical terms. IAL 1. No identity proofing. There is no formal identity verification process. The system accepts self-asserted identity. Examples: public forum accounts, free SaaS signups, low-risk applications. You provide name, email, password, and the system trusts you. There's no validation against government ID, no background verification, no document confirmation. For low-risk environments, this may be acceptable, but for enterprise access, IAL1 is insufficient. IAL2, remote identity proofing. IAL2 introduces real verification. Identity must be validated using evidence. Examples include government ID verification, knowledge-based verification, biometric validation, background checks, HR validation before account creation. Identity is verified remotely. There is moderate to high confidence that this digital identity maps to a real person. Most enterprise onboarding processes align with IAL2 in SC300 context. When you integrate HR-driven provisioning, when accounts are created only after employment validation, when lifecycle processes are enforced, you are strengthening IAL posture. IAL3, in-person or stronger proofing. IAL3 represents the highest identity assurance. Identity proofing requires in-person verification or equivalent high-trust methods, strong binding between identity evidence and individual. This is rare in typical corporate environments, but you may see it in government systems, defense environments, critical infrastructure, high-privileged national systems. IAL3 ensures extremely high confidence that the identity is legitimate. IAL in enterprise architecture. Now here's where many organizations get confused. They think enabling MFA increases identity assurance. It does not. MFA increases authentication assurance. AAL. IAL is determined at identity creation and lifecycle management. That includes how accounts are created, who approves them, what identity sources are trusted, how joiner mover lever processes work, whether orphan accounts are removed. Identity governance directly impacts IAL. SC 300 perspective on IAL. In SC 300, you are not explicitly asked, what is IAL 2? But you are tested on scenarios involving hybrid identity onboarding, HR-driven provisioning, identity lifecycle management, access reviews, privilege role assignment validation. These all affect identity assurance. For example, if a scenario says, a company wants to ensure only verified employees receive accounts, the solution is not enable MFA. The solution involves automated provisioning from trusted HR systems, approval workflows, lifecycle enforcement, access reviews. That is strengthening IAL. Practical examples in Entra ID. Let's bring this into Microsoft Entra ID thinking. IAL improvements may include HR-based provisioning integration, blocking self-service account creation for privilege roles, enforcing approval workflows, using identity governance features, access reviews for sensitive groups, privileged identity management validation. Notice something. These are governance and lifecycle controls, not MFA settings. That's because IAL lies before authentication, where organizations fail. Many organizations focus only on AAL. They deploy MFA. They deploy FIDO2. They deploy conditional access. But they never audit how identities are created, how contractors are on board, how service accounts are approved, whether shared accounts exist. That creates hidden IAL risk. And attackers love weak onboarding processes. Identity assurance as trust foundation. Think of IAL as the foundation of a building. If the foundation is weak, adding reinforced doors does not fix structural instability. Authentication is the door. Identity proofing is the foundation. Without strong identity assurance, you may be protecting the wrong person. Now, we understand identity assurance level. We understand that before any login happens, before any MFA prompt appears, the system must first trust that the identity itself is legitimate. IAL answers, who is this person? But that is only the first half of the equation, because even if the identity is real, even if onboarding was strict, even if HR validation was perfect, even if background checks were completed, an attacker can still take over that account. How? By attacking the authentication process. This is where many organizations make a critical mistake. They assume, if the user passed MFA, we are secure. But we already saw how modern attacks work. Sessions can be proxied, tokens can be replayed, push notifications can be abused, cookies can be stolen. So the real question becomes, how resistant is the authentication itself? Not, is MFA enabled, but is the authentication phishing resistant? Is it replay resistant? Is it hardware bound? Is it cryptographically strong? That measurement is called Authentication Assurance Level. AAL does not measure who you are. AAL measures how hard it is to impersonate you. Think of it this way. IAL establishes identity trust. AAL establishes impersonation resistance. Without IAL, you might protect a fake identity. Without AAL, you might lose a real one. And in SC 300, this distinction is everything. Because the exam does not ask, did you enable MFA? It asks, did you design authentication strength appropriate for risk? Did you enforce phishing-resistant methods for privilege roles? Did you block legacy authentication paths? Did you align conditional access with assurance requirements? That is AAL thinking. So now, let's break down authentication assurance level and understand why not all MFA is equal. Authentication assurance level, AAL. If IAL answers, who is this person? Then AAL answers, how resistant is their authentication to attack? This is where most organizations misunderstand security. They believe MFA enabled equals secure, but AAL is not about enabling MFA. It is about measuring resistance. Resistance to phishing, resistance to replay, resistance to token theft, resistance to impersonation. What is authentication assurance level? Authentication assurance level, defined in NIST SP 863B measures. How confidently can we trust that the person authenticating is a legitimate account holder and not an attacker? Notice something critical. AAL is not about how many factors you use. It is about how difficult it is to bypass them. 2 factors can be weak. 1 factor can be strong. Strength is determined by cryptographic binding, verifier impersonation resistance, replay protection, hardware-backed key storage. That is assurance thinking. The 3 Authentication Assurance Levels. AAL1 Single-Factor Authentication. AAL1 allows username and password or other single-factor authentication. There's no MFA requirement. This level assumes low risk. Examples: basic SaaS login, public content portals, low-impact internal systems. From an enterprise security perspective, AAL1 is insufficient for privileged or sensitive access. AAL2 Multi-Factor Authentication. AAL2 requires 2 different authentication factors from at least 2 categories. Something you know, something you have, something you are. Examples include password plus SMS OTP, password plus Authenticator app code, password plus push notification, password plus software-based OTP. Most enterprise MFA deployments fall into AAL2, but here's the problem. AAL2 is not necessarily phishing resistant. OTP codes can be proxied, push approvals can be abused, tokens can be replayed, authentication succeeds, assurance fails. This is why modern attackers bypass MFA regularly. AAL2 improves security, but does not eliminate session-based attacks. AAL3, phishing-resistant, hardware-bound authentication. AAL3 represents the highest authentication assurance. It requires multi-factor authentication, hardware-based cryptographic authenticators, non-exportable private keys, verifier impersonation resistance, replay resistance. This is where FIDO2 security keys live. This is where smart cards live. This is where certificate-based authentication operates. At AAL3, the private key never leaves the hardware. The authentication is bound to the device, the origin, the relying party. An attacker cannot proxy it, cannot replay it, cannot reuse it elsewhere. This is impersonation resistance. Why not all MFA is equal? Let's be very clear. Password plus SMS OTP and password plus FIDO2 hardware key are both MFA, but they are not equal. SMS OTP can be intercepted, can be proxied, can be socially engineered. FIDO2 uses asymmetric cryptography, is origin-bound, is device-bound, is phishing-resistant. Both are MFA. Only one is high assurance. This distinction is the heart of AAL. Modern attacks target AAL weakness. We already saw how attacks work. Adversary-in-the-Middle relays authentication in real time. Token replay reuses captured tokens. Session hijacking steals authenticated cookies. MFA fatigue exploits human behavior. All of these exploit weak AAL implementations, not weak IAL. Weak authentication resistance. AAL and Microsoft Entra ID. Now let's translate this into Entra architecture. In Entra ID, increasing AAL involves enforcing authentication strength policies, requiring phishing-resistant methods, deploying FIDO2 security keys, enforcing certificate-based authentication, blocking legacy authentication, disabling basic authentication protocols, requiring compliant or hybrid join devices, using authentication context for step-up security. This is not turn on MFA. This is design authentication resistance aligned to risk. SC300 exam thinking. In SC300 scenarios, you will see language like executives are targeted by phishing, token replay has been detected, high-risk users require stronger authentication, privileged accounts must use phishing-resistant methods. The wrong answer: enable SMS MFA. The correct answer: enforce authentication strength requiring phishing-resistant methods. That means FIDO2, certificate-based authentication, hardware-backed credentials. The exam tests your ability to differentiate MFA configuration versus authentication assurance design. Authentication strength policies. In Entra ID, authentication strength allows you to define which authentication methods satisfy policy. For example, basic MFA strength, phishing-resistant MFA strength. You can require phishing-resistant authentication for global administrators, privileged role administrators, access to sensitive apps, conditional access policies. This is AAL enforcement in action. The relationship between IAL and AAL. Let's connect everything. IAL ensures the identity is legitimate. AAL ensures the authentication cannot be easily bypassed. Without IAL, you protect a fake identity. Without AAL, you lose a real one. True zero trust requires both. AAL is impersonation resistance. Here is the simplest way to remember AAL. AAL measures impersonation resistance. Can an attacker proxy the login, replay the token, trick the user, steal the session? If yes, assurance is weak. If no, assurance is strong. Enterprise security maturity. Compliance asks, is MFA enabled? Security asks, is authentication phishing resistant? Compliance stops at AAL2. Zero Trust moves toward AAL3 for high-risk access. If you remember one thing for the exam, remember this. MFA is a feature. AAL is a design principle. You are not configuring prompts. You are designing resistance. We started with a simple assumption. Password plus OTP equals secure. But modern identity attacks prove that assumption wrong. We learned that security is not about adding factors. It is about building assurance. First, Identity Assurance Level, IAL. IAL answers the foundational question. Who is this person? It is determined at identity creation, during onboarding, through HR-driven provisioning, through governance, through lifecycle enforcement. IAL lives before authentication. If identity proofing is weak, you may be protecting the wrong person. Then we move to Authentication Assurance Level, AAL. AAL answers a different question. How resistant is the authentication to attack? Not, is MFA enabled, but is it phishing resistant? Is it replay resistant? Is it hardware bound? Is it cryptographically strong? AAL measures impersonation resistance. Without IAL, you protect a fake identity. Without AAL, you lose a real one. Together, they form layered assurance, identity trust, authentication resistance, session protection. This is the difference between compliance and real security. And in SC 300, this distinction is everything. You are not being tested on enabling features. You are being tested on designing identity architecture, designing onboarding, designing authentication strength, designing conditional access aligned to risk, designing governance that prevents account takeover before it happens. That is assurance level thinking. That is zero trust identity design. And that is how you move beyond simply having MFA to actually securing Microsoft Entra ID.